Hi everybody, welcome to ENTP1111 and this is week 4, researching and developing the business idea. Now a couple of quick things. I'm sorry about the angle of this shot and the general production values of this week's video. Unfortunately I'm filming this at home in my kitchen on my laptop because I don't have time to do this anywhere else. So sorry about that first of all, but I think if you bear with me you'll find the content of this week quite interesting. So this week's topic, as I already said, is researching and developing the business idea. Now, to do that, I'm going to break this topic down into 3 kind of chunks, and then we're going to look at some other stuff around those 3 chunks. Okay, so we're going to look at the idea of basic research, applied research, and development. So, basic research, that's the stuff that you do desk-based, secondary research to understand general concepts. Applied research, that might be primary and secondary. It's generally about understanding something specific and about starting to apply perhaps knowledge, labour, capital to a particular business idea. Development is the process of taking that research and transforming it into something, a prototype, a service concept, something that we can actually go out and test in a marketplace. Okay. Now, in the lecture notes, which are at the top of Blackboard, you get this little model that I put together. It's a 3-stage model of research. Now, there's some terms I probably need to explain to you here or define, just so you understand them. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about what I mean by primary and secondary data. Okay, so primary data, that is stuff you collect directly from people. Okay, so it might be surveys, questionnaires, focus groups. That's primary data. Secondary data is stuff that's already been collected that you go away and read. Now, the strange thing is generally you start with secondary data when you're researching. So basic research, because sometimes it's what we call desk research, and it literally does mean we're sat here typing away and we're looking online and we're looking at publicly available source of information and we're trying to understand probably the market at a macro and at a micro level. Okay, so what do I mean by macro and micro? This is an economic concept, and we're looking at macro being the market as a whole, and micro being specific elements of the market. Okay, so when we're doing secondary research, basic research, that initial research, we're generally looking at the macro. We're looking probably at the market as a whole, and maybe with some micro elements, some specific elements. It tends to be more generic. It tends to be about generating ideas and concepts. Okay. Applied research is when we take that macro level and we really start to drill down to the micro. And at this point, we move from just secondary to probably a mixture of secondary and primary. Okay, so we're probably out now talking to people, we're doing focus groups, we're doing surveys and questionnaires, lots of other kinds of methodologies that we can apply in there as well, but just in terms of simplicity for today. We're trying to be slightly more critical about the data. We're trying to understand bias potentially as well that people are generating. And whereas basic research is probably quite generic and quite conceptual, this is starting to become more customer focused. We're trying to drill down into an idea. So in your context, basic research is that idea generation, but it's also at the early stage of your idea. It's the forming stage. It's looking at all the elements around the idea and trying to see if there's different directions, different concepts, trying to understand the market, trying to understand the customer. Applied research takes that to much more depth, and then we're really trying to understand the customer's needs, their wants, their desires, and how we build something that fits those. And then we move to development. Development is all about design. Some of you may have heard me talk about this concept before. You'll sometimes hear it in Eric Ries's books called the minimum viable product. I prefer this term, the minimum lovable product. Okay, we're trying to build something that people will fall in love with here. We're trying to build something that people have an emotional response with, be it a service, be it a product, whatever. Okay, emotional responses are how we create sales. So what we're trying to do in a development stage is take the data we've generated and start to put it into a more useful context. We're applying data now to a particular defined set of goals. We're probably moving from the micro level to what you might even call the nano level. Okay, we're into a very, very small area. It's really specific. We're really focused on the outputs of our particular product or service that we're trying to create. And just as that kind of, do I pivot, do I change, do I switch, it's an iterative process as well, because we might make changes and alterations, we'll have versions probably, and it's probably also quite consultative, because we're probably at this stage working quite closely with customers trying to build and design what we're creating. Okay, so this idea of basic research leading to applied research leading to development. And this concept that basic research is very much your secondary research. Applied research is where we mix primary and secondary, and development being where we take the data and we apply it to solving the problem. Okay, so let's talk about this in a little bit more detail now. If we talk about basic research, where do we find it? Well, websites, books, journals. We're really fortunate here at Worcester. The Hive has really, really good resources, and in fact I've put a link in Blackboard that will take you to the business specific area, which talks through exactly what resources we've got. Now we can look at lots of things on company reports, we can look at market data from services like Mintel, and if you're not familiar with Mintel, for instance, Mintel's a great database looking at lots of different kinds of market research. We can look at business data, we can look at the media generally. Okay, when you're starting basic research, you're starting from key questions, you're starting from those, and they're the big questions. What problems are out there, what pains are out there, what can I solve? Okay, how does that work, why does it work that way? Okay, within that process you're collecting data and you're codifying it, you're sorting it. Okay, now codifying it literally just means we're sorting data, and you might have a very complex way of sorting data into lots of categories and subcategories, or it might just be, is it relevant, is it not relevant? Okay, because at this stage what we're trying to do is just develop those ideas and those assumptions. The biggest challenge with basic research really is defining yourself down to a scope, because you could spend the rest of your life doing desk research. You know, that's why there is a job called being a researcher. But when you're contemplating desk research, you need to set yourself a scope and a position that you're going to stop at. Okay, what is enough research? When have you done enough to stop and say, okay, right, at this stage now, I'm going to go and do something else? I'm not going to talk about that in detail in this video. We'll cover that much more in the lecture. Okay, so in our applied research stage, we obviously already have our secondary data, but now we're going to look at and mix that with primary accounts. And I've already talked about some of what they might be. So it could be customer surveys, questionnaires, focus groups. That could be anything. You could do this online, you could do this in person. Okay, from your basic research, you should have already developed, they're not theories in this case, but assumptions, let's say. And what we now need to do is test those assumptions, and we need to see if the customer responds to those assumptions. Okay, so if your assumption is the product needs to be blue, and you go out and ask 50 customers, should the product be blue, and 30 come back and say yes, well, okay, blue product's probably going to be useful to us. But from the 20 who didn't say yes, what did they say? Did they say different colours? Did they different shades? What did you ask them as a question? Were you that open in terms of the question you're asking? Did you give them a simple yes/no question? Did you give them a scale? How did you collect that data? And I'm going to talk about that in the lecture in much more detail, okay? Because when you're doing primary research, you have to be careful about how you collect data. Okay, it's very easy to collect the data you want to collect, and when you're talking to customers or potential customers in this case, you've got to think about how you structure your data collection, not just to get the data you need or want, but to get useful data that will inform product development. I'll give you a quick example of that. Scale questions can be quite popular. So rate this on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being good, 5 being bad. 3 will be satisfactory. The problem is 1 and 5 are quite defined, but 2, 3, 4, different people are going to respond differently to those. So you need to think about how you ask the question. You can ask a yes/no question, but understand that's closing off a lot of options as well. So if you say, is blue a good colour? Yes, no, and 40 out of your 50 people say no, well, we know that blue is not a good colour, but we don't know what might be a good colour. So you need to think about that, okay? That's what we're getting onto when we talk about data bias. Do you create a bias in your own data? Okay, so with our applied research, we're looking to develop and review the data. We're screening it for outliers. What I mean by outliers is weird data sets that don't fit in. They can be good and they can be bad. You'll sometimes generate an outlier because genuinely there's something useful, and you'll sometimes generate an outlier because the person you interviewed just wasn't right for your interview, or they felt like being a little bit facetious with you that day. Okay, we're looking to test our ideas and assumptions against our primary data, and the biggest challenge with applied research tends to be being critical. By the time you get to an applied research stage, it's very easy to be quite invested in this process, and sometimes you'll be looking for the answers that you want and not looking for the answers that are actually there. So remaining critical throughout that process and remaining open to what the data tells you is a really important part of the applied research stage. When we're doing applied research, we always have to decide, are we going to do quantitative or qualitative research? So another couple of terms here. Qualitative, what I mean by that is we're not looking at numerical data, we're looking at surveys, questionnaires, unstructured interviews, diaries, anything. The problem with, so qualitative data is great because we get depth, we get narrative, and narrative is something that I really like. In fact, it's my sort of research area of specialism, critical discourse analysis, so looking at stories and analysing them. But the problem with that is it's huge. So one research study I did where I looked at some entrepreneurs and their families over a 1-year period generated 1 million words of data. So that's a lot of data then to go and sift through. Quantitative data, much simpler to deal with. We're looking at hard numbers. Numbers are great because numbers are numbers, but numbers also don't give us depth. So qualitative data is really good if you want to get depth and you want to know things at a more intuitive level about people, how they behave, how they act. Numbers are great if you want quantitative data. Numbers are great if you want hard data. Okay, there are problems with each of those. So quantitative data is pretty simple. We can utilize it in quite a simple way. We can say, here's the average, here's the mean, here's the median, here's it expressed as a percentage. I can show you it on a bar chart, on a pie chart, on a polar diagram. But again, I've already given you one example of that. For instance, the scale. Quantitative data is very easy to skew because some quantitative data is data. So I can ask you how old you are. Demographic data, for instance, in that instance. Demographics, when I say that, by the way, we're looking at how we split populations. So if you hear somebody talk about demographic data, they're talking about how you divide populations. So it might be, black, white, It might be age, sex, weight, height, religion. That's demographic data. That allows us to split people up into different categories. Okay, so when we look at quantitative data, it's very easy to skew it, because if I ask a question one way, I ask it another way, I can get very different data sets. So you need to be very careful if you decide to do a quantitative route, that you really think about the questions you're asking, and you make sure the data is going to be useful at the end of that process. Because if you skew it to get the data you want rather than the data you need, yes, that was sort of a Batman reference there. I do apologise at that stage. It's 6:50 in the morning here, so the odd Batman reference is allowable. Yes, so data we want rather than data we need, then you're going to end up with problems in the long run, because you're not really going to have something to take into the development stage that's particularly useful. Okay, now qualitative data gives us much more depth, but it has its own problems. Okay, it's much more difficult to analyse, first of all. It requires very different methodologies. It takes much longer to collect, and you're going to have to do a lot more sifting in terms of qualitative data, because you're going to have to understand people's assumptions, people's starting knowledge, and people's biases. Okay, so you've probably heard the term biased before. People take a certain opinion, and they'll hold that opinion no matter what. If data shows them that opinion shouldn't be correct. In our case, though, there are data biases. So, especially with qualitative data, slightly more than quantitative data, if we don't understand the underlying assumptions of the people that we're talking to, then our data can end up being biased in certain directions. And that's just something that you guys need to think about in terms of the research that you're structuring. Okay, you can mix these two methods. You can have qualitative and quantitative data together, but again, remember that then you've got to apply different analytical methodologies. And that's great. You'll see very often in questionnaires people will have quantitative questions and qualitative questions, and that's fine, but again, you need to then consider the structure, and I'm going to talk about that in the lecture in a lot more detail. Okay, so the development stage. Oh, hold on, let's just trace that quickly, because we've had a lot of terminology in there. So basic research, secondary. Applied research, secondary and primary. Secondary data, stuff we collect generally from other sources, data that's already been created and put together for us. Primary data, data we collect ourselves. That data might be quantitative or qualitative, so it might be numbers, or it might be more in-depth interviews and more human kinds of data. And that data can have biases depending on the way we structure the collection methodologies. Okay, so that's a quick précis at this stage, because what we want to do now is take that data and develop things with it. Okay, and in this stage what we're doing is starting to design and prototype and create, as I said, a minimum lovable product. And during that prototyping phase, again, we're probably going to be collecting more data and reiterating. And that's why you'll see within the lecture note, I've given you this kind of development model, and you'll see it starts with the idea that we develop, we prototype, we test, we evaluate, we redesign, and we go back into development. And that's a constant circle. I should have probably said actually we start with design. Sorry about that. Again, bear with me. 6:54 in the morning. So we start with design, develop, prototype, test, evaluate. Now, and that feeds back into the design stage. Now, why is that kind of model important? Well, if you think just for a couple of seconds, whenever you create a product, and this is true whether it's software, hardware, whether it's a product or whether it's a service, we're always updating those services. Nothing is static. Not even the great giants of the service industry, people like McDonald's, not even their services remain static, they change. Sometimes it's in very imperceptible ways, sometimes it's in big ways. Okay, we're always looking to the customer and to the market, so the the macro, the market, the micro, the customer level, to understand the trends and to understand how we keep our products and services in line with those trends. If we didn't, they would fail. So we have to go through that cycle of design, developing, prototyping, testing, evaluating, and redesigning. So that's a really important process for us to go through, and it's important you understand as well, because if you see development as a static process, you will fail. If you develop one prototype and you say, that's it, that's all I'm going to do, my business is done, my business idea is done, you're probably not going to get anything from that. You've got to follow through that process and then maintain that process through your business's life cycle. Okay? Because if you don't, what you will find is your products work in particular times or for particular customers, but they don't have any longevity. And as I said, look at any service or product and you will see that constant process of iteration. Okay? Redesign, recreation, improvement. Now, all of this comes from a bit of theory. Okay? I'm going to talk about from the research perspective first. Okay? So the kind of research perspective that I want you to consider is what I call an action research perspective. Okay? Now this was first termed by a guy called Kurt Llewellyn back in the 60s, and he said that action research is a comparative research on the conditions and effects of various forms of social action and research leading to social action that uses a spiral of steps, each of which is composed of a circle of planning, action and fact-finding about the results of the action. So what does that mean? Well, in terms of a Llewellyn model of research, again, very similar to the model I've just given you of development, we're going to plan, we're going to do some research, we're going to evaluate that research, and we're going to feed it back into the planning stage. Now, action research is a cyclical system, and it's what we call a double loop system. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the lecture I'm going to give you this example of a thermostat. Okay. Now, it might seem strange when you read it in this context, but just understand it for a couple of seconds. If you think about that first cycle I've given you, then think about a basic thermostat in your house. So the thermostat's told to turn on whenever the heat drops. Okay. So the thermostat says the temperature in the house needs to be 20 degrees. The thermostat takes a reading and the temperature is below 20 degrees, turns the heating on. If the temperature is now 20 degrees, it doesn't turn the heating on. It's one loop. Okay, that's all it does. Okay. The problem with that one loop is it will never grow beyond that one loop. Now, in terms of thermostat, that's great, but again, in terms of your product, I've already said, if you get stuck in a single loop, your product will never go anywhere, because we're not iterating, we're not changing. We've done our loop, that's it, we've got the product, fine. In the same way that thermostat has done its job. Okay? Double loop learning is more like your modern thermostats. Okay? So we've got our first loop, our first cycle, and what we do then is we take it off into a second cycle. Now, for us, this is the idea of a smart thermostat actually saying, why am I set to a certain temperature? I've been set to 20 degrees. Why? Because the house wants to be at 20 degrees. Okay, what's the most efficient way then to keep the house at 20 degrees? Is it to turn the thermostat on regardless of what the house temperature is, or is it to heat the house up slightly more at certain times or slightly less at certain times to keep a constant temperature at 20 degrees? Okay, what's the most economical way to do that? And that could take into account a whole range of factors. It could take into account the insulation in your house. It could take into account the fuel systems that it's using. You know, for instance, is it more efficient to heat the house up more at night and let it cool during the day because of a particular fuel system? Now, Thermostat 1 isn't capable of that, but thermostat 2 is, because thermostat 2 can ask second, third, even fourth loops of questions. When you think about double loop learning, please don't think about it as 2 loops. Okay, you can have many cycles of iterating that process. It doesn't just stop at a second loop. It's just called double loop learning, because we take an initial loop, and from the initial loop we start to create new loops. Okay, and this comes out of Chris Argyle's work. Now, what that means for us in terms of development is that we have our initial stage, we take it off into a new design stage, and we start again. A new design stage, and we start again. It's a constant process of iteration and development. Okay, and that's just what I want you guys to focus on. You'll see that in the diagram I've given you. Okay, you'll see cycles over time, and at each stage that particular one is spitting out a report, but at each stage of yours it could be spitting out a new product or a new service or an iteration of your product or service. Okay. Now, in terms of this week, so you're going to come to the lecture and I'm going to develop some of these themes an awful lot more. We're going to look at some of the resources that are available in the library. I'm then going to get you guys to do a bit of desk research. So please remember to bring your laptops, because that'll be very important. I'm then going to get you to design an applied research activity. It might be a questionnaire, focus group, survey, it could be an in-depth interview, whatever. And I'm going to give you some feedback on that, and then I'm going to send you off and get you to conduct that research. Okay, now it might be that you do that in the lecture, or you need to go off and conduct that after the lecture, because that research data that you're going to collect, and it might be you need to develop your secondary research as well after the lecture, can be used to inform the market section of your business plan, where you're going to need to talk about the market research you've conducted. So it's really important, because it's going to feed directly into your assignment. Okay. I've put up a link to Chris Argyle's work, which is teaching smart people how to learn, which is looking at this idea of single loop and double loop learning. I've put some stuff on the Blackboard about publicly available data sets, which is quite interesting. I've given you a really interesting video which just takes that idea of quantitative and qualitative and explores it in a bit more detail. And obviously you've got all my lecture notes up here. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all for the lecture this week. If you have any questions or want to shoot anything over to me before the lecture, my email address is m.rogers-draycott@walk.ac.uk. So you can always give me an email, or you can ask me a question through the Blackboard if you want to as well. But otherwise, come along to the lecture. We'll start developing what we're doing from there, and hopefully we'll start to get some really interesting conclusions coming out of that. So thank you very much, guys. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care, and bye.